beginning of the 1950s, Havana was a paradise for the majority of its upper-class residents. People enjoyed luxurious lifestyles as long as they didn't live in any of the slums. The president of Cuba at the time, Fulgencio Batista, was still in office despite the fact that many people disagreed with his actions, mainly those pertaining to the torture the government used for punishment and interrogation. Carlos Saer was one of the more privileged children and lived in a world surrounded by wonders. He didn't have to dive for coins in the harbor for income, and he was driven to church regularly, unlike the beggars he often passed on his way. Living every day in such a life allowed him to fully experience the finest points of Cuba. This all changed when Fidel Castro and his guerrilla rebels overthrew Batista. Nearly everyone welcomed this uprising because they were upset with Batista's underground organizations and excessive use of torture. There were many protests against the violent image Batista's government had come to represent. However, while they thought they were being presented with a new age of affluence, they were really ushering in a new era of chaos and disarray. Many people were torn from their homes, belongings, and loved ones, Carlos Saer included. Forced from his carefree life in upper-class Havana, Saer began his new life in America and would eventually write a memoir describing and reflecting on his experiences both in Cuba and the U.S. Carlos Saer, author of Waiting for Snow in Havana, was the son of a wealthy lawyer in one of the wealthiest suburbs. During Saer's childhood, he was showered with countless luxuries while his parents, like many rich Cubans of their time, turned a blind eye to the suffering and poverty of the lower class. Saer went to a Catholic school with a select group of children from upper-class families. Contrary to what their title indicates, the Holy Brothers, his teachers, were incredibly inattentive and it allowed the regular schoolyard teasing to escalate into conflicts concerning weapons and violence. One of these skirmishes involved Saer and four of his friends throwing sharp rocks and fist-sized almonds at each other. This resulted in Saer receiving a deep hole in his head from an almond, a millimeter above his eye. While he was growing up, Saer's world consisted of a mix of Cuban and American culture. To him, being Cuban and rich was everything. He believed that Cuba was superior to everything.
Cuban piñatas were just like Mexican ones now sold in the United States, but there was one difference. Cuban piñatas were not destroyed by blows, much to our chagrin. The day I found out that Mexicans got to beat the crap out of their piñatas with sticks, I was so jealous. That must be a far superior culture, I thought.
He was taught since he was young that...
My dad told me that the Garden of Eden was here in Cuba, and that Adam and Eve were not only the first humans, but also the first Cubans, and that the entire race is kind of Cuban. He also said that this is the reason we don't have any poisonous reptiles at all.
Right before the revolution, Cuban society was weakening, but its citizens believed that with Castro's domination, their lives would improve and everything would return to its former glory. But as the decade drew on, poor Cubans became increasingly discontent with the low standard of living that they endured under Batista, who favored the elite, and rebellion began to materialize. Gunfights often erupted in the streets, and newspapers at the time were filled with gory photos of murdered politicians, rebels, and prisoners from both sides of the conflict. The political shift towards communism was beginning, and as Batista and his politicians fled the country, Castro consolidated power, finally staging a successful coup d'etat in February of 1959. But the most damaging influence Castro had on society was to force all of the parents to fear that the Cuban government would take away their parental authority. Despair fell upon families who feared indoctrination, and children were affected the most by Castro's strict regulations. Soon, 14,000 children were airlifted out of Cuba in the span of 2 years, and some never saw their parents again. Those children were sent to Miami and placed in refugee homes, orphanages, and adopted families' homes. This exodus of unaccompanied minors became known as Operation Pedro Pan or Operation Peter Pan. 11-year-old Saer and his older brother were one of the 14,000 Peter Pans who left Cuba to try to start a new life on their own in the United States without knowing what they would encounter there.
All I can remember is that within 4 weeks she was gone. Gone forever, just like all the other kids. One by one, they disappeared. Everyone was leaving. The world was being emptied of people and filled up again with replacements, all members of the Communist Party.
Living in a series of foster homes and having limited knowledge of the English language, Saer felt isolated and alone. He states that many times during these years he felt he had died spiritually, each time emerging changed and not necessarily improved. To pay rent, he worked menial jobs and had trouble balancing school and work, all the while worrying for his relatives and friends who were marooned in chaotic Cuba. He was brutally taken out of his peaceful garden and thrown into the unsafe and chaotic world Castro dictated, and then to the mysterious world of which he knew nothing about. The vicious snake has finally disturbed the Garden of Eden. Ayer's paradisiacal world is no more.